In the early 17th century, the Catholic Church needed images powerful enough to move ordinary people and strong enough to fight back against Protestantism. Religious painting could no longer feel distant or lifeless. It had to be immediate, emotional, and brutally real. And few artists understood that better than Caravaggio. He was a celebrated painter, but also a violent man who spent more time in taverns and street fights than in churches. Yet it was precisely this life among criminals, beggars, prostitutes, and the poor that allowed him to paint sacred stories with a truth no one else could match. In The Taking of Christ, Caravaggio transforms the betrayal of Jesus into something that feels less like a distant biblical event and more like a violent arrest happening inches from your face. But hidden inside this darkness are questions of betrayal, fear, guilt, faith, and perhaps even Caravaggio himself. To understand the painting, we first need to understand the dangerous world that created it. Caravaggio arrived in Rome in 1592 with almost nothing. He was young, penniless, homeless, and had already attracted the attention of the authorities in Milan. But Rome was exactly the kind of city in which a man like him could survive. It was a place where cardinals and nuns moved through the same streets as gangs, beggars, prostitutes, and thieves. Religion and corruption, wealth and poverty, holiness and violence all existed side by side. Caravaggio did not merely observe this world, he became part of it. It is almost impossible to separate Caravaggio, the painter of sacred images, from Caravaggio, the violent criminal. One identity fed the other. He lived in a culture where honor meant everything, and even the smallest insult could demand revenge. With his explosive temper, trouble was never far away. He broke the rules of life as he broke the rules of painting. Instead of presenting Christianity as a polished world of perfect saints, he turned toward its darkness: fear, poverty, betrayal, suffering, and death. Caravaggio painted the world as he knew it, not as the church might have wished it to be. To the horror of some members of the clergy, he emphasized the ordinary humanity of Christ and his followers. His saints did not float above the suffering of everyday life. They belonged to it. His models were not idealized figures from the imagination. They were working people from the streets of Rome, beggars, prostitutes, laborers, and young men for hire, people many respectable citizens considered the lowest of the city. He scandalized Rome by painting the Virgin Mary with dirty feet and St. Peter as a frightened, confused old man. The church had demanded realism. Caravaggio gave them realism, but far more truthfully than they had expected. And that same uncompromising vision would transform one of Christianity's most familiar stories: the betrayal of Jesus with a kiss. The betrayal of Jesus with a kiss had fascinated Italian artists for centuries. Hundreds had painted it before Caravaggio, but few had treated it with such physical force or such emotional honesty. To understand what makes his version so radical, it helps to compare it with Giotto's earlier interpretation of the same event. Giotto shows us the entire drama: a large crowd, soldiers, movement, confusion, and the events that will lead toward the crucifixion. Caravaggio does the opposite. He strips away almost everything that is not essential. There is no distant landscape, no architecture, no garden, and no escape from the violence. He pushes the figures so close together that the scene feels less like a historical painting and more like a struggle taking place directly in front of us. Today we are familiar with close-ups from film and television, but in the 17th century, cropping a scene this tightly was highly unusual. Giotto's drama unfolds on a distant stage. Caravaggio's happens only inches from your face. In Giotto's painting, Christ appears to be arrested by an army. In Caravaggio's, the moment resembles a street fight. Both scenes take place at night, as the Gospels describe, after the evening meal and prayer. But Caravaggio's darkness feels more dangerous. It is a world in which violence waits inside the shadows. The main light enters from outside the picture, moving from left to right, a direction Caravaggio often preferred. It falls most strongly on Jesus and Judas, almost like a stage spotlight, and may suggest a divine presence. A man at the far right holds a lantern, but the lantern cannot truly explain the illumination around him. Even the reflections on the soldier's armor seem to come from the viewer's side, pulling us into the scene as silent witnesses. Giotto makes it immediately clear that we are watching a sacred event. Caravaggio asks a more unsettling question. What if Jesus looked like an ordinary man at the moment of his arrest? Without a halo or obvious symbol of divinity, how would we recognize him? Caravaggio emphasizes Christ's humanity rather than his majesty. And while Giotto fills his image with a huge crowd, Caravaggio reduces the event to only 7 visible figures. From left to right, they are John, Jesus, Judas, 2 soldiers, a mysterious lantern bearer, and another soldier behind him. The mob appears small, but the figures are packed so tightly that a larger force is implied. If the image is brightened, faint traces of lances reveal that more soldiers may be hidden in the darkness. Caravaggio has compressed an entire biblical episode into one suffocating instant. But the deepest drama is not in the soldiers. It is in the emotional triangle formed by Jesus, Judas, and the fleeing figure of John. At the far left, a young man twists away from the arrest while someone pulls him back by his cloak. The Bible mentions an unnamed figure fleeing from the scene, and the identity of this character has long been debated. But Caravaggio gives us several clues that he intended the man to be John the Evangelist. John was traditionally considered the youngest disciple, so artists usually portrayed him without a beard. Here he is also dressed in red and green, colours frequently associated with him in religious art. In Caravaggio's compressed composition, John may represent more than one man. He can be understood as a symbol of all the apostles who abandoned Jesus and fled into the night. Yet John was also known as the beloved disciple, which makes him the perfect opposite of Judas. One escapes out of fear but will continue the faith. The other remains close to Jesus only because he has betrayed him. Caravaggio strengthens this connection through their appearance. John and Jesus have almost identical hair, and their forms seem to merge together. Christ will be taken away and crucified, while John will survive to spread and protect the Christian faith. The image may therefore suggest that the future church, represented by the apostles, flows directly from Christ himself. Even John's cloak contributes to this idea. As it rises above Jesus, it resembles a halo, while its red colour may symbolize martyrdom or the blood that Christ is about to shed. At the center of the painting, Jesus shows remarkably little outward emotion. But this is not because he fails to understand what is happening. According to the Gospels, he already knows that Judas will betray him. In Christian tradition, that betrayal begins the chain of events that leads to the crucifixion and ultimately to humanity's salvation. Christ's sorrow is therefore not the shock of an innocent man caught by surprise. It is the grief of someone accepting a fate he already understands. Caravaggio gives that acceptance a deeply human quality. Jesus appears resigned but not untouched by fear. His lowered eyes and folded hands suggest surrender, while his expression hints at the suffering that he knows is about to begin. Judas is even more psychologically complex. Giotto presents him largely as a villain. Caravaggio presents him as a human being torn apart by conflicting emotions. His face appears to contain love and jealousy, hatred and pride, determination and regret. He has completed the betrayal, yet he seems immediately haunted by what he has done. Rather than stepping away, Judas grips Jesus tightly, almost as if he cannot bear to lose him. His embrace is so desperate that the soldier must force his hands away. Even the Gospels do not give Judas this degree of psychological depth. In most traditional images, he betrays Christ either because Satan controls him or because he is simply greedy. Caravaggio gives us something more disturbing, a man who may fully understand the horror of his action only after it is too late. But while Jesus, Judas and John remain recognizably human, the soldiers surrounding them are almost without identity. And at the center of their violence, one piece of polished armor may be reflecting something far more uncomfortable: the viewer. The soldiers surrounding Christ are almost completely anonymous. We see little of their faces, and that lack of identity makes them appear even more ruthless. They are not presented as individuals, but as an impersonal force of violence. At the exact center of the canvas, a Roman soldier's arm cuts across the scene. The polished black armor feels cold and mechanical beside the exposed flesh of the defenseless Christ. The composition appears to echo a woodcut created by Albrecht Dürer roughly a century earlier. But Caravaggio transforms that earlier design into something more immediate and psychologically disturbing. Some scholars have suggested that the highly reflective armor acts like a mirror. If so, Caravaggio may be turning the painting back toward us, reminding the viewer that, in Christian theology, no one stands outside the story of sin. The soldier's arm and the swirling red cloak of John form a frame inside the larger image, a picture within a picture that traps Jesus and Judas at the emotional center of the drama. But there is another witness standing at the right edge of the scene, the mysterious man holding the lantern. He is not merely an observer, he is Caravaggio himself. Artists had placed themselves inside their paintings before, but rarely with such a visible role. Caravaggio repeatedly inserted his own face into his work, sometimes under extraordinary circumstances, including paintings created while a reward had been placed on his head. When The Taking of Christ was painted in 1602, Caravaggio was at the height of his fame. Contemporary viewers would probably have recognized him immediately. There are many theories about why he gave himself such a prominent position. Perhaps he wanted to present himself as a witness to the betrayal. Perhaps he was acknowledging his own guilt, and perhaps there was also a degree of narcissism. The lantern he carries is too weak to illuminate the entire scene. Symbolically, however, its light falls on his right hand, the hand that holds the brush and produces his art. On the opposite side, John's right hand is also clearly visible. It is his writing hand, associated with his role as the traditional author of the Book of Revelation. Through this visual parallel, Caravaggio connects the painter with the evangelist. John spreads the Christian message through words. Caravaggio spreads it through images. In the thinking of the Counter-Reformation, sacred art had a clear purpose. It had to strengthen and spread the faith. Caravaggio may therefore be placing himself within a tradition of Christian communication that begins with the apostles. For a man who lived among violence, crime, and constant danger, this idea carried a personal meaning. Caravaggio had every reason to hope that redemption might still be possible, even for the most unlikely sinner. The painting was celebrated as a masterpiece in Caravaggio's own time. And then, under mysterious circumstances, it disappeared for almost 300 years. Caravaggio himself was famous during his lifetime, but soon after his death, his work fell out of fashion. By the time critics rediscovered his importance in the early 20th century, they knew that The Taking of Christ had once existed, but believed it had been lost forever. Ciriaco Mattei had commissioned the painting in 1602. About 2 centuries later, his descendants sold it to a Scottish buyer, but by then it was mistakenly identified as a copy after Gerard van Honthorst. In 1921, an Irish woman found the painting in an antique shop while travelling in Scotland. She bought it, carried it home to Dublin, and later donated it to a community of Jesuit priests. The priests hung it in their dining room, where it remained for roughly 60 years, quietly collecting dust while one of Caravaggio's greatest works sat unrecognized in plain sight. In 1990, the painting was sent for restoration. To the astonishment of the art world, an expert concluded that it was not a copy at all. It was the original Caravaggio. In 1993, the long-lost masterpiece was finally placed on public display. Caravaggio's own final years were just as dramatic. After a killing in Rome, he fled first to Naples, then to Malta, and finally to Sicily. Everywhere he travelled, he produced masterpieces, and everywhere he went, he seemed to create new enemies. After years spent on the run, he died alone near a beach in Tuscany. He had created works of profound spiritual power while living a life marked by violence, poverty, and disgrace. That contradiction is precisely what makes his paintings so compelling. They do not present sacred history as something distant, pure, or untouchable. Caravaggio brings it down into the same world of fear, guilt, flesh, and darkness that he knew himself. He rejected the dominant traditions of Italian painting and made biblical events feel as though they were unfolding here now, directly before us. In a strange parallel with The Taking of Christ, Caravaggio's own remains also disappeared for centuries. They were not identified until 2010. Tests suggested that he had not died from syphilis, malaria, or at the hands of one of his many enemies, as earlier theories proposed. The likely cause was lead poisoning from the very pigments he used to create his masterpieces. A painter who brought divine light out of darkness may ultimately have been killed by the paint itself.